Welcome, everyone. This is welcome to FIAPO's Learn from Leaders webinar. This is a series we are doing, taking our work of training people and creating an information base on issues around animal protection, welfare rights, and a range of other issues through the medium of Zoom and webinars. We have a really interesting lineup today. We have three amazing panelists, and we're going to talk about the idea of animal rights through law, animal rights in law, animal rights in policy, and animal rights in activism. And so our first speaker is Suhrit Parthasarathy. Suhrit is a lawyer who practices in the Chennai High Court. Suhrit also has a degree in journalism from Columbia University. And Suhrit writes actually a lot on, I really encourage people to Google Suhrit's writings on a range of issues from the Caravan, the New Yorker, a regular column in the Hindu, and Suhrit has written extensively on one of the most important judgments on animal rights in India, the Nagaraja judgment about Jallikattu. And I'm really excited because Suhrit is really going to offer us a sort of a roadmap on animal rights today. Before I kind of lead on to Suhrit, I want to tell everybody that everybody's on mute. And if you have, we will have three panelists speaking, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes of question answers. If people have questions, there's a chat box. Direct them to the host and send me the question answers. I'll keep the questions, and I'll table them later when we go into the question answer session. I'm going to introduce my other two speakers before we start. Our second speaker is Rajesh Kasturi-Ranga. Rajesh is joining us from Boston today, and Rajesh is many things. Rajesh is a double PhD in mathematics and cognitive science. He's a great writer, researcher, activist on climate change. And what's really interesting is that Rajesh marries his work on animal rights and climate change together, we don't really see that often, and I think it's really important. And Rajesh has been doing a lot of work through his new platform called Socrates about the rise in animal agriculture policies in India. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about that from an animal rights perspective. And finally, we have our last speaker, Vardha Mehrotra, who's the head of FIAPO, and FIAPO is an organization that's been around since 2009, and I think I'm really excited that Vardha is here because Vardha is really I'm really hoping that Vardha is going to share insights about her work as an animal rights activist in the country over the last 9 years, and the challenges it puts forward, and how do you create a language around rights in your day-to-day activism. And I think it's going to be really interesting. I hope you guys enjoy it. As I said, please type in your questions in the chat box. Okay, so we'll start with Suhrit. Suhrit, welcome, Suhrit, please. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Alok. Hello, everyone, and a very good evening to all of you. Thank you very much to FIAPO for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be amidst all of you, albeit virtually. The work that FIAPO and its members do is hugely inspiring. I think it emanates out of a position of care and compassion. And I'm therefore particularly happy that I've been invited to share a few of my thoughts today. Let me begin, however, with a caveat. I've never really spoken at an animal rights conference before, so some of what I say might not come out of the traditional narrative of animal rights. I mean, I start, of course, I think with something akin to a basic moral proposition that all of us can agree on, which is that cruelty to animals is an affront to a host of values that we ought to treat as unassailable. But how do we go about this project of using the law to enforce norms against these forms of cruelty? And I think that's the big question, right? And my answer to this might not be in keeping with how some others who are more entrenched in the movement might answer it. I mean, I'm not suggesting that my position is necessarily the correct one, but it's one that I think is worth pondering over, if nothing else. So in asking this question of how we go about enforcing norms against cruelty to animals, a number of related questions crop up. Do animals at all have rights in the sense in which rights are commonly understood, in the sense of human rights? Now, if so, how are these rights to be administered? And against whom can they be enforced? If not, do human beings nonetheless owe an obligation to treat animals with care and compassion? Now, are any of these responsibilities inalienable? And to what extent does our constitution extend to include within its mandate a duty to ensure the safety and security of animals. So over the course of the next 10 minutes or so, I'll try and place these questions in perspective in order to allow us to seek change in a manner that is both pragmatic and constitutionally sustainable. Now, I think all of us would know that in many ways, India's legal approach to combating animal cruelty acted as a forerunner to legislation in more advanced and older democracies in the West. I mean, almost immediately after independence, the legendary and acclaimed dancer Rukmini Devi Arundel, who was then a nominated member of the Rajya Sabha, introduced a private member's bill in 1952, which was intended to replace the existing colonial era statute of 1890. Arundel was deeply influenced by the Theosophical Society, and this bill echoed many of the ideologies of the society. But in response to her bill, Prime Minister Nehru conceded that we must treat animals with care and compassion, and that how we treat our animals is a major test of civilization. But he said that we must consider this question carefully. So he said that he'll set up a set of committees, parliamentary committees, to go over Arundel's bill and thereafter allow the government of the time to come out with its own version of the bill. And he requested Arundel to withdraw her bill.
Okay.
But in 1960, what happened is when the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act was eventually enacted, which was a product of the government's draft, some of the fundamental tenets that were present in Arundel's bill were missing. For example, the law created a blanket exception for experiments that are conducted on animals with a view to securing medical advancement. But notwithstanding some of these misgivings, I think we can all safely sort of concede that the act, owing perhaps largely to Arundel, was still ahead of its times, in that it was based on this underlying belief that it is morally wrong for humans to inflict unnecessary pain or suffering on animals. And what we've seen since then, since the enactment of the Act, is that many of the sort of underpinnings of the animal rights movement across the world have been predicated on similar philosophical lines. I mean, in 1975, when the Australian utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer published his book, Animal Liberation, we saw that it was it was a utilitarian work, but it was still built on this argument that basic principles of ethical behavior called for an end to the causing of avoidable suffering to animals. Now, Singer argues against what he describes as speciesism, or the idea that human animals, simply by virtue of being human, possess a greater claim over moral rights than non-human animals do. So according to him, animals, much like human beings, can suffer and feel pain. And therefore, to treat humans as somehow special is akin really to making classifications on the basis of race or sex. Now, there are, of course, other theories. And the American philosopher Tom Regan, for example, argues that animals, at least sentient ones, possess basic moral rights since they possess an inherent value, much like human beings. But I think I wouldn't call this a mistake really, but if we were to argue in terms of personhood, as might be the logical extension of Tom Regan's supposition that animals enjoy basic moral rights because they possess an inherent value. But if we were to then say that animals possess a personhood, that is, they should be treated on par with human beings and they should enjoy rights which are prescribed under the Constitution, we will sort of get ourselves into a few jurisprudential knots. And it might stretch jurisprudence a little too far. If we were to see, for example, rights as concomitant with responsibilities, and we always have this larger sort of assumption and hypothesis, right, that everybody who enjoys rights also therefore has certain duties that he or she owes to other persons. So if we see rights as concomitant with responsibilities, the question that will need to be asked is, how do we impose duties on animals? So this is not therefore a straightforward exercise, which is why I think we saw some of these problems in the landmark verdict of the Supreme Court in Animal Welfare Board versus A. Nagaraja, where the court struck down the practice of Jallikattu and the Tamil Nadu legislation of 2009 and found that law to be unconstitutional. And I think the court's sort of conclusion that Jallikattu is a cruel and unusual practice. All of this is sort of, to many of us at least, it'll seem as fairly non-exceptional and hardly remarkable, because I mean, we would see the practice as inherently antithetical to the ideas of care and compassion that are present in the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, for example. But let me just sort of take us through this judgment very briefly. Because what happened in 2009 when the Tamil Nadu government brought about this law was that the Tamil Nadu government was essentially acting on the basis and on the assumption that Jallikattu is otherwise not illegal. Now, if you look at India's constitutional structure, you'll see that both the central and the state governments have the power to make laws on animal cruelty. But if the state government's law is in any manner contrary to the central government's law, then the state government also needs to secure the assent of the president. So this is what happened in the case of the Act of 2009, was that the Tamil Nadu government tried to regulate the practice of Jallikattu by assuming it to be legal. So it thought that this could act as a standalone law, and it didn't get the president's assent. So when that practice was questioned before the Supreme Court, the court found that this 2009 Act was repugnant to the central enactment, which is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, and therefore it struck it down. And I think it was really quite easy for the court to rule on this, at least to this extent. Because it was, as I said earlier, it was clear to the court that Jallikattu violated, I mean, apart from the Act, the 2009 Act being repugnant to the Central Act, it was also clear to the court that Jallikattu violated a slew of provisions under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. And I think the matter could really have ended there. The court could have said two things. The court could have said, one, that the practice of Jallikattu violates the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act in that it inflicts cruel and unnecessary suffering on animals. And second, it could have said that the 2009 Tamil Nadu legislation ran counter to the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, and because the president's assent wasn't secured, that act will have to be struck down. The court could have ended there. But what it did was it also made observations about animals having rights under Article 21 of the Constitution. And this, I think, is a bit of a problem because there's at least a jurisprudential issue here which needs to be reckoned with carefully. Some of you might be aware what Article 21 does is to grant the right to life and personal liberty to persons. It reads as follows. It says that no person shall be deprived of their rights to life and personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. Now, until largely until the 2000s, to in fact this judgment in the Nagaraj case, person under Article 21 was seen not as a juristic entity, but as a sentient human being, right? And only human beings were effectively accorded rights to life and personal liberty under Article 21. But what happens, as in the case of Nagaraj, when animals are guaranteed rights under Article 21 and you start saying that animals have a right to life and personal liberty under Article 21 and start treating them as persons, is that then there are a slew of other constitutional obligations that will then have to be imposed on them. And there are also other rights. For example, the right under Article 14, which grants the right of equality before law and equal opportunity to every person. Now, how does one reckon with a right of that kind when you start treating animals as persons? So this is, I think, a real serious jurisprudential problem, which in my reading is a little difficult to overcome, at least from the perspective of the Constitution of India. And I think the problem was handled much better by the Kerala High Court and indeed the Supreme Court itself when it ruled on the ban on exhibition of animals by circuses and sort of performance feats by animals. So there what the Supreme Court did was it basically examined the practice in question. And it came to a conclusion that these actions violated the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. And therefore, a notification that had been brought about by the government in the early 1990s, effectively prohibiting these practices, was valid in law. The circus owners could not claim that their rights to livelihood were being violated or that their right to freedom of trade and profession was being violated, because this was a ban that was imposed in public interest. But you'll see this problem with respect to, which I mentioned, with respect to treating animals as persons under Article 21, becoming particularly stark in the context of the more recent amendment that the Tamil Nadu government made to the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, in order to once again create an exception for Jallikattu. This time what the Tamil Nadu government did was, because this judgment in Nagaraj existed, the court didn't bring about a separate legislation. It amended the Central Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act itself, and it created an exception for Jallikattu, and it also secured the president's assent for this. This meant that the petitioners in the Supreme Court now, who are challenging the practice of Jallikattu and who are challenging this amendment, they had to do far more than just show that the PCA Act, that is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, stood violated by Jallikattu. They also had to prove that the practice in some manner or another infracted one of the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution. And this problem is only made harder by the fact that the defense for the law also rested on fundamental rights, on the idea of cultural rights, which are protected by Article 29. So the question is, how does one balance all of this? And I don't think the answer quite lies in personhood. I think it lies, on the other hand, in the imposition of duties on human beings through statutory law. And I think that's what we should really fight towards, because one, we should fight towards improving the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. We should fight towards making it a more modern statute where every form of cruelty is prohibited. We should improve the penal regime, and we should strengthen our administrative mechanisms. Now, before I get to sort of just very quickly give a roadmap on how this might work, let me also just say two other things very quickly. One is, we could look at the German example as a potential solution, because in Germany, in 2002, the constitution itself was amended to specifically mandate the state to legislate and protect animal rights within the framework of the constitutional order. Now, this has therefore meant that the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany now has to weigh the dignity of animals against other liberties, such as, for example, the right to practice religion or the right to conduct of medical research. So now any legislative exception to animal rights, for example, whether it involves slaughtering for food or the use of animals for producing dairy or whatever it might be, those legislations will have to be very narrowly tailored. And they'll have to ensure that animals' welfare is protected to the greatest extent possible, that they're proportional to that guarantee of sort of rights to animals. It's therefore clear that I think that we need something similar in India, whether that might mean amending the constitution to impose a enforceable duty against human beings, or make rights of animals more unassailable. In the sense that the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, for example, said that the pursuit of global justice has required us to include a number of others in our conception of equality as equal subjects of justice. So perhaps the idea is to now think beyond species and to think of species as not a barrier. But this would require not merely reading the Constitution as it exists today, but either amending the Constitution to bring this within the constitutional framework, or quite simply by enacting far more rigorous legislation. And I think that will help us to go a long way towards sort of fighting against cruelty to animals. And I just want to end with very quickly in terms of how we fight all of this in courts. And I think this is important because a number of you, I think, are activists who are fighting for the welfare of animals and fighting against practices that are cruel towards animals. So what I'll say is that when we are fighting these battles in courts, I think it's important to focus less on personhood, but more on statutory law. And the reason why I say this is for largely strategic reasons. Because you'll find that judges are far more attuned to looking at a statutory framework, to looking at what is the administrative law mechanism that is in play, that has been enforced by the rules that have been enacted by Parliament or by a state legislature, rather than looking at what they might consider as slightly sort of fanciful arguments about personhood for animals. Now, this, I'm not arguing here against sort of the more moral proposition that animals are persons. I'm not making this argument from a moral standpoint, as I am from a standpoint of constitutional interpretation. Because if we start making these arguments on the basis of constitutional personhood, then I think it leads to a whole host of interpretive issues. But on the other hand, if you go to the courts and show the courts either the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, show what the various provisions in the act are, show the rules that have been framed under the act, show the notifications that have been framed under the act, and point out exactly how a given practice might violate one or other of those statutory stipulations, then I think you'll see that the results are far greater, and you'll sort of enhance the larger sort of cause by doing this, as opposed to sort of going down the route of fighting for personhood. And this is just my sort of brief thoughts on this, and I'd love to hear more from the other speakers on this. Thank
Thank you
you very
so
much.
much, Surit. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Surit. Wow. So basically, so you're telling us that we should take the legislative path only.
I think, no, I'm
I
not saying
think
don't take the legislative path alone.
no, I think it's really, really interesting. So thank you so much. But thank you so much, Surit. Really, we'll come back to questions. Thanks a lot. Thanks, really. That was really incredible. Guys, we have a house full, and I know many of you are getting messages from your friends that they're not able to log into Facebook, and I think I'm sorry, now we're not able to connect a link to the Facebook Live for some reason. So we'll be happy with the 100 people audience we have right now. Okay, so we'll move on to Rajesh now and talk about animal agriculture, animal rights, what's happening in India, and what learnings we have from the West, maybe, and climate change. Rajesh.
Wow, that is quite the wide brief. I'm gonna dash all your hopes by giving a terrible talk instead. But thank you so much, first of all, Fiapo and Alok in particular, for inviting me. And it's a hard act to follow after Surit, but I'm very glad that I actually did not include any thoughts of mine on the legal aspects of what's going to happen, because we have a much better expert on that in this call. Where I'm going to start with is as a cognitive scientist, and I'm going to approach this question of the relationship between climate change, animal rights, all of these from the perspective of not of, say, formal institutional principles, but how we as human beings, embodied creatures, amongst other embodied creatures, perhaps approach this question of the value and rights of all beings. And I say this because, as human beings, we have certain capacities, and any issue of animal rights ultimately boils down to the fact that we recognize the sentience of other creatures as being self-evident. To me, this is the starting point of any discussion of animal rights or of animal welfare for that matter. And I want to make a link to the perhaps the constitutional view of this by just quoting very briefly from the US, the preamble to the US, the Declaration of Independence, right? Where it says that we consider it self-evident that all human beings are created equal. And to me, the key phrase from a cognitive science perspective is the self-evidence. Like, what does it mean for something to be self-evident? And self-evident basically means I see and I understand, right? That there's no interpretation needed. It's like if there is a tree in front of me that is self-evident because my eyes work and I see what's in front of me. And so this self-evidence is to me is the most important linchpin of addressing any argument for animal rights from a cognitive science perspective. Like, how do we as human beings and as other mammals perhaps, and perhaps vertebrates, recognize the beingness of others? And the fact that the self-evidence of the equality of all human beings did not prevent the founders of the American Republic from owning slaves suggests that there's a big gap between what is perceivable and what is actually implemented in a large, complex society. And so then the question arises, why is it that even if we agree that animals have self-evident rights, that we are not able to implement those? And to me, that's a very, very big question. And that takes us through kind of a brief historical detour, and which is really my main argument, right? That there is a gap between what you might call count noun cognition and mass noun cognition. And when I say count noun, when individuals are counted as 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And so when we perceive individuals as having rights, it's because we perceive them as discrete entities with bodily integrity that needs to be preserved and that cannot be subject to other beings' use in any fashion, right? And this is the famous Kantian claim of all subjects are ends and not means to an end. Now, the question is, why is it that, say, African Americans were treated as means to an end rather than an ends of their own? And the answer, I think, to that goes through uh, the early phase of capitalism, so in the first half of the 19th century, where you could see that the cotton gin was invented, I think in about 1793, if I remember right, Whitney's invent. And with that was a huge expansion of the production of cotton that then, of course, went to Manchester and was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. And so the massive expansion you see in slavery between 1800 and the Civil War is actually tied to the expansion of cotton production and its embedding in the industrial economy that arose. And of course, that was also the reason why India was colonized, right? And as it turns out, it was cheaper to produce cotton in India, in Maharashtra, for example, with strictly speaking free people, though greatly imposed upon, than with slave labor in the United States. And so this is a very interesting point, which is how is it that the economic factors underlying any kind of mass activity dominate over formal principles. And that's my main argument, is that when we look at climate change, when we look at animal rights, when we look at what is happening to the vast numbers of other creatures that are now subject to human control, the primary cause of that is economic activity. And I want to give you a sense for the scale of that activity. There are about 64 billion creatures who are slaughtered every year on land, right? I mean, that's an unbelievable number. And if you include fishes and aquatic creatures, the numbers might be close to 1 trillion. And that's I mean, if you just look at the size, that's such an huge size of human control over the rest of the environment. And that's why we call the era that we are in the Anthropocene, right? That in the Anthropocene, humans dominate life on this planet at a level that just has no precedent in the evolutionary past. Now, the question is, what do we do about that? But to give you another couple of other links to climate change, the nitrogen cycle, which is also primarily now controlled by human beings. So the fixation of ammonia for fertilizer is the single biggest source of nitrogen now in the on the planet, and dominates any other natural sources of nitrogen, right? And so in the Anthropocene, we are in a situation where human beings are dominating the rest of the planet at a scale that involves emissions of carbon, emissions of nitrogen, emissions of methane and carbon dioxide, and of course, as we know, the suffering of billions and trillions of other creatures in order to satisfy human economic and other needs. So then the question is, what do we do about this nexus? And again, I want to echo something that Surit said, which is that perhaps the way forward in some ways is to make alliances with people who are not necessarily interested in animal rights as much as addressing these mass problems. So what do I mean by that? So if you contrast, say, animal rights work with conservation work, conservation is certainly in India, but also in other parts of the world, are not particularly concerned about the lives of individual creatures of other species, right? They typically have concerns about species level preservation. So they will say that extinction is a bad thing, but if you shoot and kill a deer, and eat the deer, that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if there are more deer in your forest than you want, right? And so the question I would have for this group and others is there a way for people who don't necessarily have a strong concern on individual sentience in other beings, but nevertheless do have a concern at the population level, how can they fruitfully collaborate and perhaps fight for policy frameworks that reduce the mass levels exploitation of other creatures? So that's where I think factory farming is so important, because factory farming is throughout the world one of the largest sources of carbon emissions, right? It's about 18% of global carbon emissions, and that is more than the transportation sector. And so the question is, can we work with climate activists? Can we work with governments and others who are rightfully concerned about the carbon emissions and what they do to the future of human life on this planet? Is it possible to work with them, but with this animal rights perspective? And my suspicion is that that is actually a very fruitful way forward, because again, most of those 64 billion who are being slaughtered in factory farms. And so, or if you are looking at open sea fishing, they are being fished by very large fishing fleets. And so my question to this group and others would be, how do we combine this perspective on individual animal rights with the understanding that most human intervention in the natural world is at a mass scale rather than at an individual scale? Now, of course, that what's happening in the human world, and this is what happened with slavery, for example, is that states across the world said that individual human beings have rights that cannot be violated. And even in India today, despite the fact that many human Indians are being treated very badly, during the COVID crisis, what's happening to migrants has received an enormous amount of attention. But I think generally the public recognizes that every individual migrant has an intrinsic value. So my question is, but of course, the kind of policy frameworks that are being put into place to make their lives better are going to be mass scale interventions, whether they are stimulus packages, whether they are healthcare facilities. So then the question is there a way for this fundamentally mass style of intervention? How does that interact with the fundamentally individual centrism of animal rights? And I don't have a good answer to that question, to be honest, right? And we know this actually from neuroscience and cognitive science, that the brain networks and the brain capacities that help us reason about individual things are not the same as the ones that are deployed for reasoning about collectives. So we have something that is, a deep challenge. We have the fact that in India, for example, as a result of the agrarian crisis, there's a pressure on land, there is less and less land available per person, and the government will increase the production of animals as a solution to this agrarian crisis. I mean, that's already happening, and it's going to happen so much more. And so then the question is there a way for us to show that this increase in animal production is a fundamentally wrong intervention, whether you think about it as an animal rights person or whether you think about it as a future sustainability of the Indian human economy person, right? And to me, this is one of the great challenges of the next 20, 30 years, is how do we make a case for a dramatic reduction of animal agriculture and of the industrial form of animal agriculture, while not necessarily always emphasizing the animal rights framework. I'm not saying that animal rights aren't important. I think without a rights framework, it'd be impossible to guard the bodily integrity of any creature. But then the question is, how do we combine that with an understanding of the actual mechanisms through which animals are being exploited, which is in very large industrial facilities and mass sort of mistreatment. I will end with a very so for example, the Intercept, through Direct Action Everywhere, did bring out this very horrifying video of pigs being essentially roasted to death in the United States, right? And that's because basically, if you are a pig who was earlier bound for slaughter and you were not going to be economically valuable anymore, you can be killed however they feel like, right? And so to me, the fundamental injustice of the industrial system of animal agriculture is at the heart of what needs to be addressed in the future. And if we can do that in a way that climate activists and animal activists can work together, we are much more likely to succeed, because we know that climate change is a huge political topic. And so every government is going to want to address it. And so if animal rights can be closely embedded into that ongoing struggle for how to make life on this planet sustainable for every species and for humans, I think that we are much more likely to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you so much. And I think I want to tell you that the minute you mentioned the number 64 billion, our message box, we've consistently had 100 people. There are so many questions. There are so many comments, and I think this is what really this anger at these numbers what really unites us all as animal activists. It's very important that you mentioned that. It really grounds us. I really move here, and I think it's a perfect segue for Vardha. I think all these opportunities of intersectionalities and ways forward, and I won't take any more time. Vardha, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alok. Thanks, Rajesh and Surit also for your insights. Rajesh, just to, I think the debate of individual animal rights and conservation and the difficulties, that inherent tension is something that I think is a significant problem. But I'm really hopeful that COVID actually is going to be one of those things that will maybe give us more opportunities for alliances. I don't know if with the conservation fraternity, I think it's the hardest with the ones who are closest to us. But certainly with maybe other movements, we might be able to make some alliances and links. I want to start with a very I think we've heard a wonderful perspective from a legal standpoint and a perspective from a cognitive scientist. I want to talk about a really very just an animal activist human perspective. And before I do that, I want to just take a second to remind everybody that things like animals feeling pain, experiencing emotion, having rich social lives, all of these things are like the basic building blocks that we often talk about when we talk about animal rights. But I just want to remind everybody that these are not things that are very far away from us. These are not things that we need to go meet elephants and dolphins to experience. All of us who have lived with dogs or cats or cows can experience that. We've seen happy dogs, we've seen calm cows, we've seen dogs play with each other, which tell us they have complex social behavior. So all of this can be situated actually in a very pragmatic day-to-day experience of the nature of animals. And just that experiential knowledge tells us that an animal, a thinking, living, experiencing, feeling, sentient being is different from the chair that you're sitting on just now, from any object. And the reason I'm comparing the two is because unfortunately our current legal framework and policy framework treats both your dog and your chair as objects that we own. And fundamentally, that's why I believe we really need to move beyond welfare. Because animal welfare permits us to be kind to animals, to be compassionate to animals, but robs them of a much more significant intrinsic value that they have. Rajesh talked about bodily liberty, integrity, bodily autonomy, and those rights simply mean that that an animal has a right over his own body, that we can't eat them, we can't skin them, we can't chain them, we can't breed them. We talk about another basic right, which is a right to a dignified life, which means that we can't make an animal do something outside his or her natural behavior. We can't make them perform tricks in circuses or films. We can't make them race. We can't make them fight. So think about how radical that idea is in every bit of activism that you do. We are really talking about the treatment of animals by law, by policy, by society, which is in line with their biology and behavior, which means that they exist for to serve their own needs, and they're not here, to serve our needs. I want to talk about intrinsic value, which is something that Rajesh touched on. And how, intrinsic value, of course, all of us know intrinsic value is the inherent value that any object has, that is different from extrinsic value or external utility that is attached to any object. The tragedy of omission of an intrinsic value of an animal was very clearly demonstrated in the recent case of that elephant in Kerala, Soumya, who ate that pineapple with firecrackers, right? Because animals like Soumya, whether they're wild boar, whether they're nilgai, whether they're monkeys, whether they're even what we consider as pests, to be rats and lizards, these animals are not considered to have any external utility. And when we strip them of any intrinsic value, they're liable to be treated as we see fit. We can kill them as we see fit. And yes, it is important to ask for greater punishment for those crimes. It is important, and I think Surajit, when you were talking about how we need to improve the cruelty laws, I completely agree that we do need to have better cruelty laws. We need to have better punishments, but we need to also go to the root. We need to also talk about why this is happening in the first place. Yeah, because we can't just limit to being kind to animals, being compassionate to animals, but really to be recognizing a much deeper value that they have, that they're more than their flesh, they're more than their fur, they're more than their power. The conservation, fraternity that Rajesh was talking about is also riddled with these problems. When we talk about say tigers who are put in captive breeding programs, taken up and then put in deplorable conditions in zoos, because we are only seeing tigers from the point of view of the joy that we get from interacting with these magnificent creatures. If you were to look at it from the tiger's point of view, from the intrinsic value that a tiger had, the intervention would completely change. And that's why in activism, it's so important to make that distinction. Because if you were to look at it from the tiger's point of view, we would probably be campaigning for more tiger corridors versus captive breeding programs. So it's really about what is the value system that we have. Are we treating animals as something that exists to serve us, to meet our needs, and however subtle that may be, we need to save. I wonder, do we need to save the planet because we need to survive? It's a subtle difference, but it can make a very significant difference to the interventions that we then advocate for, to the conditions ultimately that these the life and conditions of these animals. The other really significant issue that I think has also been touched upon is that of economic commodification and objectification, because animals are treated as economic objects, right? Animals are treated as something that have to be bought and to be sold. And the most obvious manifestation of this is, for example, that most of us have experienced is, for example, the animal markets, where cows, buffaloes, goats, sheep, elephants, camels are marched for miles to come to these markets to be brought and sold for their body parts, for their secretions. We hear of also the cruelty again. There's chili rubbed in their eyes, their tails are broken, they're lame, they're hungry, they're thirsty, all sorts of absolutely horrible, cruel things which must be punished, which must have a stronger law to make sure that cruelty doesn't happen. But that's the ceiling, even if you have the best law which prevented the chili rubbing chili rubbing is, but there are many, even if you had the happiest cow, you would still not be allowing that cow to be to be living according to the cow's behavior and biology. And that's the ceiling. That's the frustration. When you talk about the pet breeding industry, you're talking about, you claim economic rights over the uterus of an animal. The conversation in the breeding industry is never about, is it even right to take puppies away from a mother? The conversation about, should it be 2 months, should it be 3 months, should it be 6 months? I mean, that's an absurd idea. The whole point is that we do not have economic rights over these animals or secretions of these animals. And ultimately, this is why we keep coming against a wall. I mean, even our anti-cruelty laws. In Indian Penal Code section, I think 428 and 429 says, it is illegal to injure or maim any animal whose economic value is, or whose monetary value is greater than rupees 10. Our anti-cruelty laws are all geared towards being of welfare of animals, of being good to animals. And that's also how our language is. That's also how our society is. Interestingly, I feel that Indian culture is more, sort of recognizes intrinsic value. I think anybody, and we all have grown up and understand, whether you're religious or spiritual or not, it doesn't matter, but we all understand that the socialization process tells us that all life is sacred. That is something that that's often talked about. But in law and policy, we don't see intrinsic value. We don't see all animals are treated as economic objects, and we keep running against this wall. That only permits kindness, that only permits compassion, that only that really robs them of a much deeper value that animals have. And I think ultimately that's really why we need to move beyond welfare and move to rights. So Rohit, I think we do need better cruelty laws, but I think we do also need some radical thinking to move beyond that kindness, compassion framework.
Thank you so much, Bharata. Thanks a lot. That was really powerful. I think, just to say that I think Surat is not saying that we don't need that. Surat is saying that to create that, we can't go to the courts to create that. The recognition has to come from something much more tangible, like legislation making, which I think also Bharata very strongly believes in. But I think, as we've seen in India, all activism is a combination of going to courts and going to the government and marching on the streets. And I don't think animal activism should be any more unique. Guys, this is a really, I thank you all three of you, first of all, to really be so concise and be on time. And I have a lot of questions. Guys, all the audience, please be kind to me, because there's 100 of you and there are so many comments in the chat box. So I'm a little bit overwhelmed, but I want to start by, I'm summarizing a lot of the comments, okay? But, for the first, I want to ask Surat. Surat, would you say, something sort of linking with what Rajesh and Bharata are saying, would you say that, well, maybe Nagaraja went too far, but is it right to recognize an idea of dignity in animals? Okay, would you say that we can say that animals have dignity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can make a very good argument without classifying animals as persons, that they're still ends in themselves, and that therefore we need to sort of ensure that they have rights against human mistreatment. So I'm not making my argument broadly only on the basis of welfare, but as much on the basis of animal rights as I am on the basis of welfare. But I don't think that conception of animal rights needs to be derived from Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees right to life and personal liberty to human persons. So I don't think we need to derive animal rights from those existing provisions of the Constitution. There are other ways to derive these rights. And Nagaraja, let me just sort of clarify what I had said earlier, which is that, I think it's an extraordinary judgment in many ways, in the sense that it comes from a deep position of moral sort of rectitude and moral correctness, in that the bench there felt very strongly that animals deserve a certain form of protection distinct from what they've already been offered under the existing legal framework. But which is why I think that we need to take this one step further forward from Nagaraja and try and bring about change, both by amending the existing Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, either by altogether repealing it and bringing a more comprehensive legislation, but also by sort of strengthening our administrative framework in how do we go about addressing practices which infringe the existing legislation, and how do we sort of set up legal protections which we can then use to go to the courts and get and get redressals from. And I just want to make one final point, which is that this idea of rights, right? I mean, there's all, you look at the kind of expansion of rights that the Supreme Court has made from the 1980s onwards. Now, there's a tendency to view this expansion in a positive light. But what we've seen is that this expansion of rights hasn't necessarily translated to the expansion of remedies. And this is a deep problem which we're facing today. And let me take an example from something completely unconnected, if I may. This has nothing to do with animal rights. Now, if you look at the judgments given recently on 4G internet in Kashmir, now you have this idea that the right to access the internet is an extension of our right to free speech, is an extension of our right to do business. And these are therefore recognized as fundamental rights guaranteed to persons. But you still go to court, and the court still says, no, I don't think we are quite the right body to decide this. Let's relegate it back to the government. They're in the best place to kind of decide on this. So we've not necessarily seen this expansion of constitutional rights being accompanied by remedies. On the other hand, if you strengthen your statutory framework, if you say that these practices, X, Y, Z, would violate animal rights, and let's call it animal rights, if we strengthen that, then we have a much better chance of being able to get remedies from courts and remedies from the existing legal sort of framework.
Thank you so much, Surit. Rajesh and Varda, I'm going to throw this at you. The overwhelming sort of comments that are coming to me are really, for the first really important comment, which I think I share with all our attendees, is how do you fight this multi-billion-dollar industry? If they're slaughtering 64 billion animals in a year, how do you pose a challenge to something that is so large and mammoth? Where do we start?
Okay, before I try to answer that question,
I mean, this is I'm only being a medium for the audience.
Right. Let me first post in the chat window a link, because I think many people are interested in sort of at least where the source of these statistics are. So I've just posted that into the chat window so that anybody can take a look. And the numbers do vary, but I think 64 billion is perhaps on the low end.
Yes.
So I actually think that is why aligning with the climate activists is so important, because every climate activist now will agree that factory farming is a bad idea, right? Now, and to me, this is potentially it's a very powerful political argument in my view, and I can see that why that is that's a potentially slippery slope. But I'm saying that in terms of very vast sweeping changes, and it's not just going after factory farming as a struggle, but also looking at alternatives to factory farming. I mean, I do think that technologies are emerging, and this is where one has to ask whether you are techno-futurist or whether you are nativist in some sense. But I do think that means of food production that aren't tied to slaughter, combined with the increasing unacceptability of factory farming for various purposes, is perhaps the most effective location for political action. I mean, that's my claim.
Varda.
I just, I think two thoughts. One is the thing about factory farming, the way trends are going, I think it's a safe statement to make that factory farming is certainly on its way out. And when I say way out, maybe it's going to take us another decade, maybe it's going to take us longer, I don't know. But factory farming is not, we are already seeing the trend. We're already seeing lots of legislation across the world that is improving conditions for animals, whether it is based on animal welfare concerns, or now increasingly on climate change and environmental concerns, health. Of course, public health is a huge area, which antibiotic resistance. but I think factory farming, and of course, Rajesh is not, I'm not saying that it's going to happen on its own. I think all of us are going to have to work towards, having factory farming to really see the back of it. But I think that's certainly something that, I'm hopeful and I'm fairly confident that, will end. I think in terms of what are the interventions? How do you solve such a massive problem? The only, I don't have an answer, and I don't have an answer to how do you solve this. It's a massive question, I don't know how one answers a big question like that, except that, we need to accept that there are going to be multiple approaches that we're going to need to solve a big problem like that. That this big problem is a complex issue. It's not a single issue. It is not just to do with animal welfare or climate change or public health or worker rights. All of these things are interlinked. It's going to involve changes at the industry level, changes at the government, changes in consumer behavior. So we are going to have to need multiple strategies. We're going to have to need a framework, and I think hopefully the animal movement globally, the environmental movement, and I think I saw, I think in the US recently there was sort of a news item I was reading about worker rights organization asking for a ban on factory farming, or slaughterhouses during
Exactly.
COVID, So I think there are multiple ways, and I think we are going to need these multiple ways to solve these problems.
I also want to say that, as Vardha said, I think a responsible animal rights work will also have to, in a very sort of self-conscious way, deal with livelihood issues. We have to address the livelihood issues. So we are not saying that, okay, we want to go and sweep out things and not talk about livelihood issues. So these are very complicated issues. And I think and I find that a lot of climate change people actually, Rajesh, in India, in my experience, a lot of climate change activists in India do not actually take a strong, clear stand against animal meat. And I think this is a really big struggle. I think it's very rarely done the way it's being done in the West. It's not being done in India. That's my experience. And I think we have to work on it, yes. I have a question on, there's there are two questions. One is about the idea of bringing change in our society, and how do you bring about change in the society? A lot of people are saying that would anybody like to comment about should, for example, compassion to animals, or the idea that the animals have rights and we must treat them as equal, should that be part of a school curriculum? Should we start teaching kids at a very early age what an animal is, and not just a figure in biology or wildlife? Rajesh?
Boy.
I mean, think of it in cognitive perceptions. How would a child see an animal if it's taught to respect an animal as a child?
I think that all children are innately, meaning this is the self-evidence of the sentience of other animals, I think is pretty clear to every child. This is my, right? And I think, in fact, if anything, it's taught out of you.
Oh, wow.
That's how I see it. I don't think, I haven't yet to meet a child who isn't fascinated by other beings and isn't sort of instinctively aware of their beingness and their sentience. So I feel like it's, in fact, the institutions, the adult institutions that we have created that have gone into exploiting.
That's a great answer. Vardha?
Yes, I think, and I always advocate for multiple interventions to be tried. Should this be included in the curriculum? It depends on what, and I think any campaign, any change campaign needs to have very focused expected outcomes. So if our outcome is to reduce observable behavior to cruelty to animals, that happens actually, like Rajesh is saying, at maybe a later stage, once the socialization process kicks in, and children tend to be more cruel to animals as they grow older. So maybe at that point in time, if there's specific learning outcomes that we want in specific groups or geographical areas, then education programs can certainly be a good thing. But you can also run an education program badly, so we need to be very mindful of how we use these.
Yes. I mean, I just want to draw people's attention. Hey, first of all, it's 6 o'clock, but I'm not ending the call because we have another 30 minutes on our slot. So I'm going to keep the conversation going because the people are there. If you guys start leaving, then we'll end. Okay. If you're there and you're interested and you're talking, we'll keep it. Sorry, Surit and Vardha. I hope that we can keep the crowd engaged. There's a really interesting message in the chat box where a bunch of activists have written about Dr. Rao's work on climate change and animal farming and the link to that. And I hope people are also noticing all the information that is being shared on the chat box. That's really, really interesting. Somebody just asked me, there's a journalist in the attendance. The journalist has asked me a question that a lot of people working in the animal community get asked regularly. She's saying that why is there such a strong right-wing leaning in the animal movement in India? And I've answered to her briefly saying that the animal movement in the country is very diverse and has all kinds of people in it. And so they have many different personal beliefs along with their belief in animal rights. So let's not generalize it. But I thought Rajesh is the founder of Animal Left. I thought Rajesh would like to answer that.
So, I mean, I feel like, frankly, drawing this as, are you, in favor of human communities who say are typically meat-eating communities, and do you agree with their exploitation in the name of saving animals, is a kind of a specious argument. I mean, to be honest, nobody who's using, say, for example, cow slaughter as a way to target Muslim communities is really ultimately, I think, interested in the rights of cows. I mean, I think that their actions make that clear in my view. Now, however, I do think that it's possible to genuinely feel compassion and attribute value to other species and have all kinds of prejudices against other human beings. I mean, this is, we are all human beings and we therefore have all these things. I think drawing this as a fault line that either you are in favor of beef eating or you are in favor of animals is, I think, a wrong way to frame this question. And I think that we would all be much better off if we understood where the exploitation of both human marginal communities and of other species is coming from. And at least from an animal left perspective, that is by looking at the socioeconomic system that we are all embedded in.
Vardha?
I think the movement is hugely diverse, So I mean, I'm not sure about why, I mean, this idea that that the movement in India is rights-based. Have I understood the question correctly, Alok? That why is the movement so rights-based in India? Is that...
No. The question is, why is the movement so right-wing aligned?
Oh, right-wing aligned. Okay, now I understand what Rajesh is talking about. I was like, rights-based in India. Yeah. I mean, totally. Of course, I mean, I think that's a more recent phenomenon. I think there is a lot of lack of clarity on what animal rights. What animal rights. I guess in some ways that's work for the movement to do, to have clear ideology and but I think because of the rise in a particular species, bovine welfare protection sort of views. I'm not sure how else to put it, but because of a specific kind of a animal being protected and the profile being raised, I think there is more criticism. But I think that is inherently specious, right? I mean, if you're only talking about a cow, and that too only a Indian cow, not a foreign breed, not a Jersey cow, but only the female Indian desi cow being protected. That to me is not an animal rights perspective at all. So I don't even agree that the animal rights movement is right wing, because I don't think that's the animal rights position.
Surit, would you like to comment on this?
No, I mean, I don't have too much to add. I think I agree with Rajesh and Vardha broadly in terms of where one ought to stand on this. I think that if people are coming at it from a focus of advancing the cause of animal rights, then it's to be respected, whether they're coming regardless of other ideologies. But broadly, you don't want the movement to be appropriated by other motivations, and I think that's the only thing that one needs to be careful about, in a sense that you don't want a movement for the welfare or the protection of animal rights to be appropriated by other groups whose intentions might be far from actually sort of advancing the cause of animal rights.
Exactly. Exactly. That's very well put. Thank you. Guys, would anybody like to ask any questions, or I can ask the three speakers to give a brief concluding comment, and then we'll end then. Because I think we've got a very excited audience, and there's just a huge discussion happening. I wish you guys, I don't know if you're noticing in the chat box, there's a massive discussion happening, a really amazing discussion. I'm really glad we facilitated it. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with another order now. I'm going to start with Vardha and start a short, brief concluding comment, and then we can just conclude back to Surit after Rajesh, and we can end the talk. Thanks.
I guess being an activist myself, I guess I would love for everybody to go back and look at their activism with the lens of animal rights. To really to really challenge the walls that we face, to really challenge the I mean, we all talk about speciesism, of course, in our activism. But particularly in terms of law, all the difficulties that we face, and really use the principles of intrinsic value, use the principles of economic commodification to see how and where we are running against those walls, and to, because it has such a significant impact on what you do. I mean, the second you change your lens from what is actually the animal's behavior and biology, the intervention completely changes, and the movement changes, So I think that's something that I would really encourage everybody to do as we all sort of go back.
Rajesh, yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank everybody again for this very lively discussion. I would love to actually spend another hour just talking to my fellow speakers on the things that we both agree and disagree on. That would be quite the awesome follow-up seminar. But let me end by saying that I think with the COVID crisis, we now know that the non-human world is actually an active agent in human affairs. I think that we can't any longer deny that. And so any politics of the future, and therefore any discussion of rights, any discussion of the value of other species and so on, now has to be done in this planetary context, right? In which all beings have intrinsic value. And I think I think that this is going to be the story of the 21st century.
Thank you, Rajesh. Surit.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of reinforce what I was saying earlier, which is that I think it's sort of important to see animals as ends by themselves, and as not as means to an end. And I completely agree with both Vardha and Rajesh on that. I also think that the sort of movement needs to focus. I mean, I'm only trying to say that from a point of view of strategy, in terms of how one can try and bring about change, to focus as much as possible on bringing about legislative alterations to the existing framework to try and replace the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act with a more progressive and more sort of modern day animal rights legislation. And then thereafter try and take the battle to the courts and try and have that legislation enforced. And I mean, maybe the sort of solution lies in trying to amend the constitution eventually, similar in a fashion similar to what Germany might have done. But before we go that far, to try and go at it like sort of step by step, and try and ensure that we can have a legislative framework that will really do justice to the rights of animals, and try and thereafter take the fight to the courts and have the legislation enforced. And that would be my sort of one-line kind of solution to all of this, or at least sort of attempt at a solution to all of this. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you so much, all of you. I think animal rights is a vast topic, and I understand that for a lot of people in the audience, the pressing issue is really talking about veganism, is about behavior change, is about animal agriculture. But we've addressed a lot of these points. I hope that all of you have learned some things that will inform your work and all the incredible work you do in your daily life in helping animals, in protecting animals, in talking about animal rights, in promoting plant-based diets. And we at FIAPO only wish you the best, and we hope that these conversations aid you in your work. That's our really our main intention, and that they kind of empower you, give you the strength, give you skills, give you knowledge. And I hope that you take this forward. Guys, I know that Vardha, because Vardha is my boss, my colleague, she's not on Twitter, but everybody else wants to know whether you guys are on Twitter. Vardha, you need to be on Twitter now. There's a massive demand. Everybody's saying that give us a Twitter handle of all the three speakers. I've never seen such a vibrant chat box. So, Sudhir, can you type in your Twitter handle if you don't mind? Because people want to follow you on Twitter. And Rajesh, if you can type in your Twitter handle, please. And Mariam, can you type in the FIAPO Twitter handle, please? Thanks so much. Guys, we've recorded this conversation. We'll put it on live and on our website and a link, and also on our Facebook. Thank you so much once again. Please join us for the next Learn from Leaders webinar. Information soon. Log into our website, fiapo.org. Go to our Facebook page. Follow us on Instagram. Look at our work we are doing. Read our reports. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye.